Hello, we're now beginning our second unit. We're going to be looking at thinking skills. That includes language and intelligence as we go along. We're going to begin with the cognitive theorists. There are two of them, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. We're going to start with Jean Piaget. Now this tells us what cognitive theorists think about. There are no surprises here. Cognitive theorists feel that thinking is an active process. We are actually aware when we are thinking. They also feel that how we think changes across time. We're beginning with Jean Piaget. Ultimately, he spent most of his career at the University of Geneva. He'd been born in Switzerland into a well-to-do family, many of whom dabbled in scientific research. He was bright and he was very well educated. By the time he was 11, he had published a scientific paper on an albino sparrow, and he was considered an expert on mollusks by the time that he was in his teens. His PhD was in zoology, but he switched over to psychology after taking a course taught by Carl Jung. We'll talk more about Dr. Jung when we do the chapter on personality. After this, Piaget moved to Paris as a young man, and he began to work with Alfred Binet. That's another person we'll be talking about later. For Binet, it's in the chapter on intelligence. Binet was working on what we now call an intelligence test. Piaget was one of the people actually administering the test items to children, and he noticed something. I'll give you an example here. When individuals are asked a question, they'll either reply with a correct answer or an incorrect answer. However, incorrect answers aren't random. They fall into certain patterns. For example, if we ask someone, how many things make a dozen? They will answer 12, on rare occasions 13, or sometimes with encouragement, they may take a guess. The most common guess is 10. That's pretty close. The individual has some concept of the number of things that make a dozen. Another wrong answer is 100. That's a nice round figure, but it's not even close to a dozen. We don't get answers like 73 or 42 or 6,781. Oh, by the way, another common incorrect answer is eggs. We'll repeat the question here. This response suggests that the individual has not processed the how many part of the question. Now, working with this population of children, Piaget noticed that younger children often made the same incorrect responses, as if they were all thinking the same wrong way. When he would ask them to explain their incorrect answers, he began to gain insight into their thought processes. His idea was that children think not just quantitatively differently from older children and adults. That is, they're not just deficient in knowledge, but that they think qualitatively differently from older children and adults. There are fundamental differences in how they think. This was a new thought in the world of developmental psychology, a revolutionary new thought. Much of what we know about Piaget comes from this lady, Barbel Inhelder. She began working with Piaget first as a student, but eventually became his chief collaborator. We credit her with writing down and helping to disseminate Piaget's theories. Well, what was his theory? Well, he felt that we actively strive to understand the world around us. We do this by constructing schemas. Schemas organize material and give us some level of understanding. Now, when new information comes along, we check it out to see if it fits into our schema. If it does, life is good. This process is known as assimilation. So, What happens when new information does not fit? Well, in this instance, we call it accommodation. We make it fit. We make little adjustments to our schemas. Let me give you an example of accommodation in action. When my son was 3 taking his bath, he announced, "Black things float." The schema that he had constructed said that color is the critical variable for whether or not something will sink or float. Well, I couldn't possibly let that go. For the next several months, I would introduce a variety of different items into his bath routine. He would predict if the item would float or sink. Eventually, he'd made a lot of accommodations and constructed a big, convoluted schema. One of the items in there was things float if they're made of plastic and have blue writing on them. It took a while and some outside of the bath experiments, but by the time he was 4, he had, with help, discovered the principle of buoyancy, which is a thing will float if it weighs less than the amount of water it displaces. Otherwise, it sinks. Now, the nature of the schemas we construct will be characteristic of our stage of development. So, how do we get from one stage to another? What happens is that there are one of two processes. If the information fits, that we can either through assimilation or accommodation, we can make it work with our current schema, we are in equilibrium. We're not going to be shifting stages at this time. But if the new information cannot be assimilated, cannot be accommodated, we have to develop a radically new schema, and depending on the nature of this new schema, we may shift from one stage to another. So, obviously, Piaget was a stage theorist. He felt that thinkers pass through certain stages. He even suggested substages, which we won't be bothered with. The first stage is the sensory motor stage. This is when we are coordinating visual information, auditory information, tactile and olfactory information, all of these with movement. The sensory motor stage lasts from birth to about 2 years. Note that this coincides with what we know from Luria's theory, that there are these primary areas of the brain that register sensory input that develop during this time span. 2 characteristics of this stage are object permanence and causality. With the infant who does not have object permanence, you can cover up something and it's not only gone, it never existed. There's this annoying game young children play where they're sitting in their high chairs and they drop a thing from their high chair and they look for it and then they want it back and then they drop it again. As aggravating as this is, it means that baby is experiencing a major cognitive spurt. Also, FYI, a game that's played with babies across all cultures that taps into object permanence is peekaboo. With causality, the baby learns to connect events, especially actions and consequences. And are there ever a lot of baby toys out there that encourage and promote this? We're stopping here and we'll pick up with the next 3 stages in the next section.